All right, colleagues, it's 4:05 my time, 3:05 Geneva, and of course, different times, different places. We have a good number, 30. Usually we have 80 or more people attending. Probably it's the summer holidays and people are enjoying their time. Although I am supposed to be on leave, but of course we have a commitment towards you and towards to delivering a very good product at COP28. And with that, let me provide you with some very positive, very delightful information. We have been given a pavilion, the first in history of the history of COP. The pavilion will be in the blue zone. And the delightful thing is that we have been given a very large space. In fact, it is 4 times larger than any other pavilion that was given to anybody else, even 4 times bigger than UNEP's pavilion. Which is with the support of the presidency of COP28 and their keen interest to engaging the faith community and work with them towards a better output of the COP, engaging with non-traditional players in terms of climate change and everything that is surrounding it. So this is great news for everybody. And this is, of course, due to all of your work and support and the impact you have been having everywhere. So congratulations to everybody. The second delightful news as well, we have confirmations, the invitations have been sent out that we will have a high-level faith leaders summit in Abu Dhabi on the 6th and 7th of November with the participation of very high-level faith leaders, including the head of the state of the Vatican, Imam al-Azhar, the heads of 30 different religions and CEOs of interfaith organizations, as well as young people, women, and scientists. This would be an excellent opportunity for the high-level faith leaders to issue a statement contributing their commitments towards working on achieving the Paris Agreement, but also they are willing to establish a long-lasting and institutional mechanism to keep faith leaders engaged, not only as sidelined contributors or actors, but effective actors in the issues of climate change and other, whether it is environmental issues or global challenges that we are facing all together. So this is, again, an excellent news. It will be under the patronage of the President of UAE. The invitations have been signed by the COP president, and it was sent last Friday, and we have started receiving confirmations from high-level faith leaders. So the work, our preparatory work, as well as what will happen at COP28 will be in the core discussions of the high-level meeting. So congratulations. This is, again, something that we should all be proud of. Your organizations, your leaders have been contributing to making the voices of faith-based organizations and faith actors loud and clear, and they have been they have become to be main players to be engaged with. As all of you know, we have started this series of thematic discussions discussing the priorities, the issues that will be discussed at COP28. We have had 3 thematic discussions so far, and this is the 4th one. We discussed the priorities of the COP, we discussed the stock-taking exercise, and we discussed the loss and damage. And today, we will be discussing climate financing. And we have with us a dear colleague, Remco Fisher, who has been working with UNEP Finance Initiative for over 15 years. Kai, or probably as he likes to be called, Remco, has been pivotal in the work of the Finance Initiative. And probably, of course, he will talk about the Finance Initiative, which is, probably more than 30 something years old, engaging with the finance system, the banking, the insurance, the all the systems that have to do with financing and issues of moral but economic responsibilities. And they have issued a number of initiatives, and I leave the floor to Remco to tell us all about that, but more importantly, how this is linked to the Paris Agreement and what is the role of the financing system, how other non-traditional players can contribute or should contribute, and then we can take that and reflect on it and go back to our own institutions and discuss with them the possibilities of engagement. With Remco and the Finance Initiative, we launched 2 years ago the Moral Imperative Initiative with the World Council of Churches and the Muslim Council of Elders and the Rabbi Consortium in New York. And the moral imperative is to encourage faith leaders and faith actors and even individuals to press and work with their banking systems that they use to shift to a morally responsible banking system that avoids investing in oil and gas and other environmentally unsustainable investments. So with no further ado, I would like to ask Remco to take it over from here. And of course, we all are ears with interest to learn from you. Please,
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Iyad, and thanks everyone for joining the session today. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for having me, and also for the kind words. Just to further complement, Iyad, what you were saying in terms of where I work and what I do there. UNEP has a UNEP finance initiative, which is a UNEP-run network of 500 financial institutions. That's commercial banks, largely commercial insurance companies, some investors. We also have a number of state-owned, so public financial institutions such as development banks in the membership, but largely the focus really is on the commercial side of things. And UNEP-FI has been around since 1992. It's fair to say well ahead of its time. At that point in time, no one was connecting truly the dots between environmental degradation and the world's financial system and financial sector, which obviously today many are doing, thankfully so, and fortunately so. But at the time, it's fair to say UNEP-FI was ahead of its time. I thought I would structure the talk today, firstly, by speaking without slides. So the first part of my talk will be without slides, and then towards the end, I will be adding a few slides to give you also some more visual guidance. And I thought I would talk a little bit about the journey that we have gone through as UNEP-FI over the years, or in other words, how we have worked as UNEP with the finance sector over the years, and where we stand today, because there's been also a shift in concepts, a shift in ideas, and a shift in how we view the responsibilities really and the roles of the private sector at large when it comes to climate change, but also within it, the finance sector. But before I go there into that journey of UNEP-FI, you could call that the sustainable finance journey, I also wanted to just touch base a little bit. The talk today is called climate finance. And many of you might know it's a very broad term, climate finance. It basically means everything that has to do with finance and climate change. But in the intergovernmental negotiations of the COP process, et cetera, the term has a very narrow meaning and has had a very narrow meaning over the last decades. And really, it means international transactions of public finance. So basically, when you say climate finance in the intergovernmental process, it means industrialized rich countries making transactions to developing countries so that developing countries can use those resources to better engage in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And that whole agenda is really, really important. This agenda around what some people call the financial mechanism and the financial architecture under the convention. So how between North and South, there needs to be also a flow of public finance around climate change in the same way that such flows exist on ODA. And it's also fair to say that those flows remain too low. Now, what I wanted to convey is that even if those flows were larger, and perhaps someone would call them appropriate, in the grand scheme of things, if you look at the total volumes of investment and hence the total volumes of financing that are needed for global society to tackle climate change, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side, that public finance probably plays a marginal role. Just to give you some figures here, the total volume of investment that we need to tackle climate change, there's various estimates, but it's most that I've seen, it's between 1.5 to 2 trillion of investment per annum. And that investment for mitigation adaptation needs to be financed through grants or through debts or through investments. We focus, because we work with the private sector, of course, more on debt and investment and equity investment, not so much on grants. And that is the need. And as many of you will know, within the intergovernmental process, when we look at climate finance defined in the traditional way, the last decade has been focused on the so-called Copenhagen 100 billion that I think we're barely now reaching after many years of negotiation. I think we're barely, that level of public climate finance is being reached just yet, which is great news. But contrast that with, what is needed, and you will quickly realize that the challenge here, as useful and needed public climate finance is, ultimately us effectively tackling climate change is not through finance, is not a matter of transactions, of doing a transaction here or doing a transaction there, or increasing, certain funds here and there. The challenge is a lot more systemic. We need to adjust financial systems, economic systems, so that the volumes, so that basically climate change becomes embedded in everything that gets financed. And through that way, it gets systematized and atomized across the system in a way that then delivers those 2 trillion that we need. And that's exactly our focus. We don't focus on climate finance the way I've just defined it. As Iyad was saying, we focus on the financial system, the financial sector, and the actors there. The private sector actors predominantly. Why? Because the overwhelming amount of finance out there is in the private sector, comes from the private sector, comes from savers in the economy, not necessarily from taxpayers. So that's been our focus. And our mandate as UNEP is simple. We help the finance sector, we catalyze the finance sector to green itself so that it can then also green the economy, which is needed. And of course, on climate change, greening the economy means two things: decarbonizing it so that we reach net zero emissions by 2050 in alignment with 1.5 immediately, as soon as possible, and that we also, green economy also means, of course, an adapted economy and adapted, resilient society. Let me tell you about how we've done this, how we've worked. I mentioned the journey at the beginning. And over the years, we really approach this through putting ourselves in the shoes of financial institutions and translating climate change into terms that they would understand. And so it became really ultimately a a discourse around risk and return. So a discourse around risk and opportunities, trying to convey to financial institutions what are the risks and what are the opportunities that climate change from a business perspective brings to you, and how can you exploit those risk opportunities most effectively. And the reason we did that was because we're convinced that if we get as many financial institutions to take climate change seriously through a risk and return lens, that will green them. They will take the issue seriously. They will understand the risk and the return ramifications, which is what drives their behavior, and that would help green them, which again is our mandate. And then on top of that, what we also focused on a lot was disclosure, transparency. Could we get these financial institutions to show to their clients, to their stakeholders, to the world, well, what are the risks that you're exposed to? And what are the opportunities? And here, through that disclosure, the objective was, of course, transparency will create competitiveness between them. They will, try to outcompete each other on who is, seizing those opportunities the fastest through the market actors that they are. They are competitors. They're market actors. They have a risk return management mandate in society, and transparency. Very much the objective was would catalyze it. Now, in 2017. Something happened that really advanced this whole risk and opportunity disclosure effort by all actors in society, not only financial institutions, also companies around the world. And some of you may have heard this. This was the TCFD, which is the acronym. It stands for the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which was convened by obviously mainstream actors from financial regulation, which was also, a great development in itself. At the time, Mark Carney, as governor of the Bank of England, and also as chairman of the Financial Stability Board, and it was G20, established this group. And what this group put out was really music to our ears. They said, well, for these risk and opportunity disclosures to be really useful, they need to do a number of things. They need to be forward-looking. So you should not be, if you want to measure as a financial institution and report on your carbon risk, you should not be looking at what's happened last year or this year. You need to be looking ahead. You need to be more long-term, and that's obviously one of the key bottlenecks that we face in economic decision-making. That's all very short-term. And so you need to be looking at the prospect of there being a carbon price, for instance, in 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. And that should inform your risk and your behavior today. And that surely will start shifting you away from say, high carbon clients, high carbon investments, etc. The other thing that this TCFD framework in 2017 did was, so forward-looking, number one. Number two, it said, the finance sector, you are not only consumers of the reports and disclosures that you get from your portfolio companies, so from your investee companies, from the people that you lend, the companies that you lend money to, you yourself, the financial institutions, you are carriers of climate risk. You need to be disclosing yourself. And the third thing that this framework did really well in 2017, that really we've been focused on a lot, again, the TCFD framework, was it was quite comprehensive in mapping the variety of climate-related risks and elevating the importance of those to this financial institution audience. So we have transition risks, which are and opportunities, risks and opportunities always. Transition risks, which are basically the risks that the financial risks emanating from the low carbon economic transition. So basically stranded assets and other or the deteriorating financial performance of say fossil fuel companies, etc. There's this, and then the opportunities are of course investments in renewables, energy efficiency, sustainable land use, and the list goes on. Physical risks and opportunities. So how is the changing climate changing risks and opportunity landscapes, and then also litigation risks. So we were big fans at the time of the TCFD, and it's highly complex. So we convened our members to develop methodologies. How do you do scenario forward-looking risk assessments? How you disclose those? We've been working with hundreds of financial institutions, and the key learnings that have then informed the next steps in the journey have been climate change is landing in the consciousness of the leadership of the finance sector, which wasn't the case up until then. All of this, understanding the risks and opportunities remains complex, but it's doable, and it's being done more and more. But most importantly, what we had to acknowledge at the time was, yes, there is the financial risks and opportunities that this framework captures, and it's important that financial institutions measure and disclose those risks and opportunities. But this is an effort at, in essence, keeping the resiliency of the finance sector in the face of climate change. It's protecting the resiliency of the finance sector. It is not a frame, it's a framework for financial stability, you could argue. In the light of climate change, it's not a framework for climate stability. For instance, if you're a financial institution, you believe that the future will be 4 degrees warm, then from a pure financial risk management perspective, you would have to adapt to that and not a 1.5 degree future because of the odds, and because you may actually be, creating financial risk by aligning yourself with the reality that doesn't exist, if that makes sense. So that's why, or you can be a bank that excels and superb at climate risk management and spotting climate opportunities, and still not aligned with the Paris Agreement or the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got the financial risks and opportunities, and on top of that, the community had to add another layer, which is that of impact and alignment. So we cannot only be looking at how climate change is creating things for you. We need to look at how you and your financing your portfolios is having an impact on climate-related parameters. First and foremost, emissions, but then of course also adaptation-related parameters. And this is something that we have been since 2018, pushing a lot as UNEP. We want financial institutions not only to be sound managers of climate-related financial risks and opportunities. We want them to drive the society's efforts towards net zero by 2050 and also resiliency. And the way we are, and this is very new. This is a very new idea. That financial institutions would not be driven by something that are financial metrics, but by something that are environmental metrics. I mean, to us in the environmental community, it may seem like, well, it should be. But if you're a financial institution with shareholders, with regulators, with clients, and everyone looking at your financial metrics and your financial metrics only, it wasn't the case. And we've tried to make it the case. And the way we've done this is through a number of alliances. They're all voluntary. This is the best we can do as UNEP. We're not a regulator. We can bring people together in a credible way. And we have formed a number of finance sector alliances, one for commercial banks. We formed a number of alliances whose members, financial institutions, commit to decarbonizing their financial portfolios in line with the scientific scenario. So in line with the IEA 2050 1.5 scenario, in line with the IPCC. And the way we've organized this is through these alliances, 3 of them, one for banks, one for institutional asset owners, so pension funds and insurance companies and sovereign wealth funds, and one for insurance companies. And I'll wrap up in 3 to 4 minutes, but I did want to show just a few slides to everyone to get across what we're trying to do through these alliances. So if we could put the slides up, Arne, that would be much appreciated. We can move straight to slide 2 in the deck.
Can you see the slides?
I don't. I just see a black screen. I don't know if I'm the only one.
Yes, then it's still loading.
Okay. So I can get ahead. I'm conscious of time and that we want to leave enough, room for discussion and Q&A. Aligning a financial portfolio with a greenhouse gas emissions pathway that is consistent with, say, the Paris Agreement or 1.5 basically means you need to reduce the emissions associated with your lending and with your investment in line with that scenario. So you measure your financed emissions and then you reduce them. That's the commitment they have, that these financial institutions in these alliances have made. And as that happens, the theory behind it is, of course, that you start replacing on the books of financial institutions. Then over time, that would catalyze things in the real economy. That replacement, the word replacement is quite important. You're replacing your exposures to unsustainable, high carbon assets, business models, technologies with the green alternatives to those. And if you're doing that, that will show in a reduction of your financed emissions. And if you're doing that in line with scientific scenarios, then you can claim that your organization and your financing, of course, are aligned with that scenario and or with the Paris Agreement. I still cannot see the slide. Can other people see the slides?
No.
Perhaps, yes. I think my computer is a bit struggling. Could you
Oh,
share
now,
the
now I
slides?
can.
I have shared them with you.
Now I can. Now we can, I think. So what I've just said, if you want to move to slide 2, Arne, this is what I've just explained. On the left-hand side, you see this portfolio decarbonization and how that then leads to a replacement of, in essence, unsustainable high carbon assets with the equivalent. If we go to the next slide, and of course, what happens in the financial economy, then the expectation is, doesn't translate immediately into the real economy, but it catalyzes things and it accelerates things in the real economy. And the reason why we need to be looking at replacement is because, and not only the green side of the equation, is because if you look at this data here, this shows you investment and finance patterns or investment into various energy sources, renewable, nuclear, battery, but then also fossil fuel power. And you can say, yes, there's been quite a bit of growth on the renewable energy side of things, but that's not decreasing investment to the fossil fuel side of things. So we're almost like, building a green economy or a renewable economy on top of, a fossil fuel-based economy. And that's why we need to not only look at how do we boost green, but how do we boost green in a way that also it replaces the not so green, the unsustainable. And our role is UNEP obviously pushing that thinking and that ambition with our members through commitments. Just a few more slides to give you an idea of how these alliances operate. There are many of them. We as UNEP facilitate 3 that you can see in this box on the right-hand side: the banks, the asset owners, and the insurance. The asset owners have been around the longest, since 2019. The other ones are a little bit newer. All of these alliances you may have seen have come under severe attacks from parts of the US political spectrum, and that has caused some damage to these alliances. One of the alliances, the Insurance Alliance, had, as a result of those threats and attacks, has had to reconfigure. But there's other alliances there that come together in the wider, so-called glass, defense ecosystem. Next slide. And what are the key elements in these alliances? What makes them, from our perspective as UNEP, especially the ones that we convene and that we know the best, as credible as they can be as voluntary platforms? They require a credible, formal, explicit commitment of aligning portfolios, of reducing finance emissions, coming from the top of the organization. Then the members develop, together with civil society and with UN counterparts, develop guidelines to then translate that very high-level commitment into guidelines of how do you set targets for your portfolio, for your exposures, to get the emissions down in a way that's science-based. And we have a number of guidelines documents there for the various alliances. Next slide. There is an annual reporting and monitoring that needs to happen on, well, how are you making progress towards your targets? And if you're not making progress towards your targets, there's also, or if you are disregarding your targets, there's also an accountability mechanism that is multi-stakeholder, and that ensures that members of the alliances who are lagging for no valid explanation are then identified and dealt with. And then the most important thing, I believe, is, and then I'll stop, what this is. The finance sector is powerful. Clearly in a market-based economy, the finance sector is at the core of things, but it's also not almighty. The finance sector alone cannot tackle climate change. But what we're trying to do here is make the finance sector a more credible interlocutor to the other stakeholders so that all together can find a networked solution to tackling climate change. So what we're trying to do here is saying, look, if banks, commercial banks, asset owners, and a critical mass of those can commit to net zero by 2050, not only that, they can commit to intermediary targets already 2 years from now, 2025 or 2030, that are aligned with the long-term commitment, then others should be able to do the same, including governments, which currently we know they're not. So I think this is also an effort to show that the private sector is willing to do these things, that at times they're even going beyond governments, despite it's not their mandate. This is the mandate of governments, so that we get an interesting stakeholder dynamic here in a virtuous cycle going between the various stakeholder groups. So this is, I would say, one of the main points of these alliances, because by themselves, of course, despite the power that and influence that the finance sector has, it cannot by itself solve fossil fuels, solve emissions, etc. And I'll wrap up with, you can go to the next one. This shows the next slide. It'll be my last one. The next slide, just to give you a sense of what, when I say targets and that these are science-based and that these are relevant and that these are meaningful, what do I mean? This is, for instance, an excerpt from Citibank's. This looks at the energy and power portfolio, and the targets. You can see, so what's the emissions baseline? What are the scopes that are included? Scope 1, 2, and 3. We can go into the details also during the discussion. And then what's the target by 2030, and what's the scientific scenario? In this case, it's the IEA net zero by 2050 scenario that all of this is based on. So these are the types of targets that are being set across these alliances. They're quantitative, they're science-based, and they are informed by these vetted and published guidelines that I've spoken about. I've gone over a little bit of time. I stop here, and very happy to engage in discussion and conversation with all of you.
Thank you very much, Remco, for this rich and informative, presentation. And I think there's a lot to digest. I have in mind, of course, I will open the floor for everybody. But you mentioned that UNEP FI has been engaging, or a part of its membership, there are more than 500 banks. And I know that you're talking about banks, institutions, not branches. So we're not talking about a bank in a corner of a street. We're talking about bank systems. And they deal with trillions of dollars. Isn't that enough? I mean, 500 banks with trillions of dollars. So what is the size that we are talking about if we want to establish a positive trend towards climate financing? If these 500 banks are doing what they are supposed to be doing in terms of responsible financing, responsible insurances and investment, what is missing? What is the size? Are we talking about 10% of the global financing system? Are we talking about 20%? So how do you see that? I mean, why we're not seeing that positive impact?
Because those who really lead the system aren't moving in tandem. Governments are not moving in tandem. Let me just paint this out a little bit more. You look at the governments and the commitments they have made, and and very positively, most governments have said, they want to be net zero by 2050. Some have said 2045, and others like India, China, of course, being developing countries, have set later stages for them. That's really encouraging. What is not so encouraging, you look at the NDCs, which are the more, those long-term targets are very aspirational. What would give them credibility is if the NDCs lined up with those long-term targets, which they don't, because the NDCs, you put them together, it's a 3-degree world, not a 1.5-degree world, or 2.7 or 2.8-degree world. So there's a lot of talk and aspiration from government. There's very little short-term, action over the next decade. And what we're trying, and this is different in these alliances, because in these alliances we say, yes, you make your aspirational commitment, but then you translate that into shorter term. By 2025, by 2030 are the milestones. Targets for your portfolios by which you need to have decarbonized. And so these alliances are going, their members, to a certain extent, they're going ahead of government. But they can also, when they start implementing, they need to be able to take their clients with them. They are very powerful. They are very dependent on their clients. They're nothing without their clients. A bank, needs their clients to be also moving with them. And the clients are spread out across the economy. And of course, the banks can do certain incentives, and we are mobilizing them to provide those incentives and to the clients who decide to move on. But what is lacking at the moment is that the actors around these alliance members also start moving. Were they moving like these alliance members? Would we have, a majority of governments with NDCs that are 1.5 compatible, with targets by 2030, by 2025? That would, of course, then set in motion the systemic shift that the banks could then be a part of, and obviously also catalyze and influence, et cetera, and finance. But it just doesn't work by any one stakeholder group alone. There's only one stakeholder group that can solve crime, and that's government. Everything that comes from private sector ultimately is voluntary, and it's positive signaling, necessary signaling, useful signaling, but ultimately it cannot be a lot more than that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I have 3 hands raised, or 2 now. I will start with Joy Kennedy. Please take the floor. We still can't hear you. Yes, but it's too low. Yeah.
Thanks for being succinct.
Not really. No, we can't hear you.
Maybe I'll put it in the chat.
We can hear you speaking, but we can't hear your voice.
Hey, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So let's go to Grove Harris. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this informative session. I hope it's okay if I put out 2 questions. Remco, thank you very much for your presentation, and I'd like to ask you to think with us about the inequalities that are built into the system that you're describing. There's a new report out now documenting again how much it is people without assets who are bearing the burden of the climate change impacts, and it's those who have these massive impacts, assets, who have in fact benefited financially over all these years from the situation that we're now in. So I wanted to ask you about the role of taxation as a way that governments can signal really that there's a dramatic need for change. And also, when we think about stranded assets, is there a way to get underneath the view so rampant in finance that those assets are at their current valuation, deserved, earned, et cetera, when really we know they're actually owned by the 1% who have benefited? And then Iyad, if you'd be willing to address for a moment anything you might know about the way religious leadership is being defined, because as you know, we need a full system inputs here, and I would be concerned that we're going to get the top-down male hierarchical leadership who has on the one hand power and on the other hand vested interests in things staying the same. Is there any input to say we need youth, women, again, following the mandates of the SDGs in who's invited? So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for. Shall I go ahead and I can try to address those questions. One around the inequalities. I'm obviously, in the same way that it is the industrialized world and the OECD world that has been, emitting for centuries, whereas other parts of the world have much more recently started emitting, and so there is, of course, that historical context that needs to be considered, and there's therefore also, obviously, there's been for years, and also therefore the response to that, the common but differentiated responsibilities, principle in the UN negotiations. In a similar way, of course, it is those involved in producing goods and services and those involved in consuming goods and services who have much higher carbon footprints than those that don't. Right? Our mandate as UNEP is to work with the finance sector, those who manage the assets, and so almost by definition, we're working on that side of the equation. In trying to get those emissions down. I don't think that we have. So I think the question of beyond how do we get the finance sector of getting emissions down, our mandate is not necessarily to work on the much bigger theme, which is kind of the extent of redistribution or the lack of redistribution in economies. I find that's probably a bigger challenge. It's a very relevant challenge, I agree, but it's not something that falls within our mandate. I am sure you mentioned taxation. I am sure that my view is certainly that part of one thing that governments can do, a lot more widespread perhaps that they're doing at the moment, is, for instance, to tax emissions through carbon pricing, and more so than things like labor, and to create the incentives and sanctions, to create the incentives to reduce emissions. And while not obviously putting the burden on those who least can afford it. Now, what we've done in such a regard, for instance, what we can do as UNEP, or as UNEP, what we've been doing, and I had it on one of the slides, but I skipped over it, is, as I said, one of the points here is that we get the members of this alliance to be more credible interlocutors. They're committing to changing themselves. And then once they've made that commitment, they can more credibly approach others for change. So what we've done, for instance, the alliances are putting out, they've made their commitments, they're setting their targets, they're doing all of that. And then they go and say, governments, we need carbon pricing. And we need carbon pricing to follow the following characteristics. Then they go and say, governments, we need your coronavirus stimulus package to be green, to not double down on fossil fuels, but to be green. So that's what we can do: mobilize these actors based on the credible commitments, on the credibility that they have gained through joining the alliances, to be also more credible interlocutor and demanders of the policy changes that we need. And I would argue that includes fiscal policies, and there's a paper put out by the African Alliance. It's one of the slides that I had on governmental pricing that starts addressing those things. Yes, and on stranded assets, just one point. I think there's a lot of talk about stranded assets. the thing with the thing that will strand assets is government action. On the emission side of things. On the physical side of things, it's the climate that will strand assets. I mean, we're just seeing this in California, and we've seen it in Hawaii. How many assets have been stranded there by physical climate change? Many. But on the emission side, so when we talk about fossil fuel assets becoming stranded, the only thing that will strand those assets is again government action. It's because a government says, well, we're phasing out fossil fuels, or a government says we are, putting up in place the carbon price. And again, we're not seeing that determination by governments. So even the argument around stranded assets becomes less strong. In fact, we see a number of industrialized governments, obviously expanding fossil fuel production at present.
Thank you. Before giving the floor to Vanya, I just wanted to answer the question about faith leadership. Of course, we cannot deny that mostly religions are hierarchical and patriarchal. So this is a fact that we need to accept and we need to work with. Because our aim is to engage them rather than to agonize them and to, send them away. So we need to accept that. However, what we're doing is that we are injecting other voices that are not heard and those players that are not usually invited to the meetings of high-level faith leaders. In our meeting that we are planning in November, we have invited more or less around 80 people. 30 of them are the usual suspect of faith leaders, the highest Catholic, the highest evangelicals, the highest, and so on and so forth. But the rest, the 50 other people are women leaders, youth, scientists, politicians, and so on. So we're trying to bring some balance in the voices. Of course, we cannot invite everybody because there are so many leaders out there. It is just to, prepare the launching pad for the engagement of those who are concerned. And then, of course, we hope that this will be, will have a butterfly effect and bring everybody on board and to support, this cause. So, Vanya, if you want to have the floor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear
we
you
can
well.
hear you.
Hello from Malta. I've been a climate journalist since 1997 and been to 21 COPs. And I also work as a climate change consultant on Latin America. I have 3 questions for Remco. One is, how do you assess the conference organized by President Macron in June about redesigning the international financial architecture? How do you assess the activities of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action? Are they really delivering anything? And what are your expectations from the IMF World Bank annual meetings in October?
Okay, thanks for those questions. I'm not sure I'll have answers for all of those, simply because some are slightly outside, my focus of work, but I can still reflect here. I think on the need of on some of the topics discussed, I believe, at the Macron summit, and also obviously some of the topics that hopefully will be discussed during the Bretton Woods meeting shortly. The Asset Owner Alliance, which is one of the alliances that we convene, has has gone on the record, has published papers and requests to the shareholders of the MDBs and the DFIs and all of the international or bilateral and the providers of development, public development finance, asking that their focus needs to shift from dispersing public finance only to actually unlocking private finance. So the focus needs to shift towards using public finance a lot more efficiently, because that's really scarce, in a way that de-risks mitigation, adaptation investments, and is able to attract much larger volumes of finance. And the fundamental reason behind that, of course, is what I said at the beginning of the meeting, that the challenge is so systemic that it cannot be, that governments need to unlock it. They need to unlock things smartly through policies and through targeted surgical financial interventions, but that ultimately the bulk of investment and financing needs to come from the private sector. And the Alliance feels that at present, that is not sufficiently the case. So public finance is not being used enough to mobilize much greater volumes of private finance. And I believe that is, though, I believe that is one of the topics discussed and advanced during the Macron summit. I expect that discussion will also be advanced more during the IMF and World Bank meetings. What was the second question?
The coalition of finance ministers for climate action, now with 90 countries.
Right. I mean, I think it stands to be commended that it's the mainstream of finance is organizing around climate change. And I think we're seeing that through the work that we do, which is private finance. And I think a good manifestation of that is that also financial ministries, which of course manage public finances, are also organizing around these topics. I would think that collectively, the actions of finance ministries around the world have, unfortunately, the same. I'm not talking about the coalition, I'm just talking about the phenomenon on the extent to which financial ministries are taking action across the world on climate change. And I would think that in the same way that the total action of national governments around the world is insufficient, I spoke about that at length earlier, that the same applies to financial ministries, which of course are part of those central national governments. So I'm sure it's much to be commended. I think the Alliance is trying to push exactly that point. But if you look probably at the actions taken by finance ministries around the world, they are not aligned with Paris. And there's no, I don't think that there is a, plausible medium-term trajectory for the majority of finance ministries to become aligned with Paris in the short-term future. So we need to work on that. And what we can do is point to what the private sector is doing.
Thank you very much. There are a few questions in the chat, and we have only a few minutes. So let me try and ask some of them anyway. And we promise that if we don't cover all the questions, we will try to get answers. One of them is saying that, indigenous people do actually conserve and work on afforestation and forest conservation and so on in reducing the carbon impact, but they are not benefiting out of the carbon trading system. So if there is a carbon trading system, governments benefit and they rechannel it probably to development that is not sustainable or not climate friendly. So how can we ensure to solve this issue? The other question is that around the narrative of climate in general, and Joy is mentioning that, of course, everybody knows what's happening in Canada, the forest fires that are having substantial impact on not only on the climate and environment, but on the livelihoods and lives of the people. But still, those who have the power, the oil companies and so on, they still have the upper hand in deciding the decisions around economy and financing and so on. and we're not hearing the other voices of the need to change and transition to a better economy or a greener economy. And the third question is about the big oil companies and virtual banks as they deal and move throughout the world enormous sums of money. Would it be possible to tackle them as financial institutions in pressing for commitments? And finally, I believe Grove is saying that it is about the moral responsibility that we need to, or I confused who asked it, but it is about the moral responsibility that we need to bring about to people who are in the decision making on financing, whether it is the financing system or the government. So just a quick reflection on all of that, Remco, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the good question. I think that the first question really addresses a big problem, but it is a problem a little bit at present outside also the remit of our work, and well, because it is first and foremost, I think, a question as to how carbon credit schemes and emissions trading are designed, and the extent to which in those designs, there's access also to indigenous communities. So I think that's the fundamental challenge there. Of course, I can see parallels also to financial inclusion topics. So the question of, how are marginalized communities, including in many places indigenous communities, do they have financial services at disposal that they can use? Can they have a bank? Can they, this is the whole microcredit discussion. And so I see certain links there. Certainly, I would argue those who are doing the work to reforest and forest should gain at least some of the benefit for that. That goes without saying. And those communities then should be able to also access financial services better in a way that they can also participate in carbon trading, for instance, because they may need microcredit, they may need a bank account to put their earnings onto, and those types of things. But this is not something that we tackle directly. Now, I think the second and third question were really then about the relationship of the role of fossil fuel companies. I think it's fair to say that it is of fossil fuel companies, of course, who are hesitant to radically change their business models, hesitant to also obviously destroy their business models, which is understandable. And also the governments within which, in the same way, the government that host and export fossil fuels are in a very similar situation. So I think there is a challenge here to say, well, how can we transition away from fossil fuels, which at some point, or unabated, let me put it that way, how can we transition away from unabated fossil fuels, but also having in mind and all of the various interests at hand. I'm thinking, workers in Canadian oil sands, or I'm thinking, even the shareholders, the pension funds, the pensioners who have shares in fossil fuel companies. It's all a very nuanced and complicated picture. Very advanced countries like Norway, that are doing obviously great contributions on climate change at the same time for energy security reasons, for the reasons that I've mentioned, are expanding fossil fuel production, if I understand correctly. So it's a very nuanced situation. clearly we need to move, the science is imperative, the science is clear, we need to move away from unabated fossil fuels. And I think the contribution that the finance sector can do is through engaging in the alliances that we have. The targets that financial institutions are setting cannot be achieved if their fossil fuel exposures evolve over time. They become a lot more carbon efficient themselves, that they reduce and explore, that they shift to other technologies. So that's baked in. They will only achieve their target if they are able to work with their fossil fuel clients to transition. If they're unable to work with fossil fuel or clients, then and they still want to achieve their targets, then that would mean that they would have to divest from the fossil fuel companies. And so all of this then means that through this work, financial institutions are starting conversations about emissions with their fossil fuel clients that they would not have started 5 or 10 years ago, because now they have their own decarbonization targets to achieve. And those conversations, of course, are all about transitioning away from unabated fossil fuel, but transitioning away from unabated fossil fuel in responsible ways, the ways that are responsible, vis-a-vis the fiscal revenues that governments rely on from the fossil fuel industry, the workers, and yeah, even the shareholders. There's a lot of pension money in fossil fuels. It's decreasing, but it's still the case. And all of these intricacies and nuances need to be taken into account. I don't think it's black and white divest. If we shut down fossil fuels, we will have the economic and social effects that happen in the aftermath of the Ukraine invasion. We will have that a lot more pronounced. So it's not about cutting off fossil fuels. It's about being smart in designing a transition that is responsible, but also a transition that is determined. And I think through these alliances, the finance sector obviously is being mobilized to play a stronger role on that than in the past.
Thank you very much, Remco, and apologies that we are behind the schedule, but this has been an excellent discussion and very informative. And as I know, Remco will be at COP28, and currently we are, I believe there will be 5 or 6 sessions on faith and financing, discussing that over the 2 weeks of COP28. So we would be delighted to invite Remco to speak at those and continue the discussions, of course, among all of us. So thank you very much. Stay tuned to the upcoming thematic discussion. We will send you information on that. Thank you, everybody. All the best and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Remco.